Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome to the virtual Wilson Center. My name is Robert Daly. I direct the Kissinger Institute on China and the United States here at Wilson. And we are finally able to put on a program that Ray and I had been planning since January or so, The Politics of a New Mulan, which is going to focus on a number of issues related to Disney's latest feature film, which most of you have probably been following one way or another, and which some of you may already have seen. This movie is a little bit of a time capsule from the point of view of U.S. China relations. It was green-lighted and begun in 2015, when the relationship was very different. The American national security strategy wouldn't name China as a great strategic challenge and even threat to the United States for another 2 years. We were still in 2015 at was probably the tail end under President Obama of an era in which engagement, coevolution, mutual benefit were some of the grounding assumptions of U.S.-China relations. So they greenlighted Mulan, and then they went ahead and produced it and planned it and released it, perhaps a little too oblivious to what had been going on in the meantime, the 5 years. And this is where the time capsule comes in. When Mulan is finally released in September, we have had major demonstrations for several years in Hong Kong, and then the imposition of the national security law. We have had a trade war. We have had technological friction and pressure for decoupling, all of which have been amplified by the presidential election. And we have had the revelation, very importantly for this film, of detention centers for about 1 million Uyghurs in Xinjiang, the autonomous region in the northwest of China. So with the emergence of this film and its reception in the United States, in China, and around the world, we have an opportunity with this artifact from 2015, which bears the assumptions of 2015, to examine how the relationship has changed in the intervening 5 years, and perhaps to look at how, under this new dispensation, we're willing to interact with each other. I thought that to frame up today's discussion, it might be useful to do a quick illustrated history of U.S.-China film relations. So I'm going to share the screen with you now. Let's go through it again, just a brief, sort of a sprint through U.S.-China film relations and representations, especially of China on film. This, of course, is 1937, The Good Earth, which won an Oscar for Best Actress for the French, not Chinese, leading lady, a part that probably should have gone to Anna May Wong. But 1937, the year that Japan invades China proper, and this was a time of tremendous sympathy in the United States for China, which Pearl Buck's story helped to bring to the fore. After 1937, there are relatively few films about Chinese in China, although we continue to get things like Fu Manchu and Charlie Chaplin films. Then if we move forward to the 1960s, we get The World of Susie Wong, sort of a shameless hooker with a heart of gold story saved by a great performance by Nancy Kwan, but that is about treats an American artist in a still heavily colonialized Hong Kong. China, though, in this period was clearly an interest of American filmmakers. We had 55 Days in Peking, Charlton Heston here, but David Niven was in it as well, about the 1900 Boxer Rebellion. In 1966, The Sand Pebbles, which took a very critical look at gunboat diplomacy, here with Steve McQueen. Robert Wise directed it. Then, but what I really want to spend time on is film since the opening, since 1979. And an early film, now really charmingly, naively outdated, but I think still worth your time, was 1986, A Great Wall, directed by Peter Wong, who also acted in it. You see him here on the left. And this was really a getting to know you movie set in the period before the Tiananmen Massacre of 1989, about a Chinese-American family going back to Beijing to meet relatives they haven't seen in a long time. And it's a family film that examines all the changes that have happened in the United States and China since the family was separated. Largely forgotten now, but I think still worth your while. A big splash then in 1987 with Bernardo Bertolucci's The Last Emperor, which won the Oscar for Best Film. and which really sort of splashed Chinese exotica all over the screen. 1987, again, before Tiananmen, when things began to change in U.S. China relations. A watershed year in the film history of U.S. China relations was 1997, when there were 3 different films released in America and around the world that took a very critical look at China. One was Red Corner with Richard Gere, Martin Scorsese's Kundun about the Dalai Lama, and 7 Years in Tibet with Brad Pitt. 1997, when there was still an artistic interest from Hollywood in China, but not yet a strong commercial interest from Hollywood, was the last year in which you had films that were critical of China. China objected strongly to these. Disney, which was a distributor on one of them, ended up apologizing. And since then, we haven't seen films from major American studios that look at China critically, because studios have been looking at Chinese box office and sort of courting Chinese viewers, and therefore cooperating with Chinese censors. This is examined, by the way, in a new book just out, Chris Fenton, Feeding the Dragon, a Hollywood insider and deal maker who had a sort of Paul on the road to Tarsus moment and realized that the deals he was doing to make money for Hollywood studios were actually helping China to censor what is in the American octoplex. So in 1997, this issue of censorship begins to emerge. The following year, 1998, saw Disney's first Mulan animated film, which was a big success in the United States, but was not very well received in China. In fact, a Chinese cultural commissar said at the time that had Disney cooperated with China in writing and making the film, it would have been far better and far truer to China. Hold that statement in mind. That was 1998. 2000, we had Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon by the NYU-trained great Taiwanese director Ang Lee, which brought Chinese wuxia or kung fu epics to many American viewers for the first time, although they'd been a staple of Hong Kong and Chinese film at this point for decades. This too won an Oscar for Best Foreign Language Film and set off a wave of jealousy within China itself. Directors for several years in mainland China tried to remake versions of Crouching Tiger in order to win their own Oscars. We get then in 2008, The Great Kung Fu Panda, which was a really interesting look at storytelling, international storytelling about China. This was by DreamWorks. It was an American film, entirely Chinese in its themes and its settings, that was extremely successful and very welcomed in China. And it set off an interesting debate within Chinese artistic circles. People were asking in a sort of anguished way, this marvelous film, very funny, very warm, using Chinese motifs and Chinese themes, but why didn't China make it? And a number of Chinese cultural critics' answer was, China didn't make it because if China had tried to get this script through, the censors wouldn't have let someone like Jack Black play the panda, wouldn't have let him be bumbling and charming and funny. If this were made in China, and again, this was a Chinese critique of Kung Fu Panda, censors would have insisted that the panda be a hero in the sort of humorless and grand Chinese tradition, the Gai Shi Yingxiong, the hero of the world, and he would have been stripped of humor and humanity. This was, again, a Chinese critique of Chinese film based on Kung Fu Panda, which was probably the most successful film to date in appealing to both Chinese and American and worldwide audiences. Now as Hong Kong, it's now 2009 with the film 2012. And this is the period in which Hong Kong is full out courting Chinese audiences and also courting Chinese money as financing for films. And so a series of films, most notably the disaster film 2012 and then 2015's The Martian, present China through its technology as the savior of the world. It is China that swoops in to provide a final solution to worldwide disaster in 2012 and personal peril in the case of The Martian. Meanwhile, back in China, a lot of China's leading directors are also looking at binational casting. and bringing major Western stars into their films. This is The Flowers of War, Zhang Yimou's 2011 film about the rape of Nanking, starring Christian Bale. I think also aiming for crossover appeal, but it didn't do very well with American audiences. Chinese filmgoers didn't really embrace it either. But you see during this period, Chinese filmmakers, they're making a tremendous amount of money, great box office in China, and they're now able to attract top international talent, Oscar winners, into their films, both for international appeal, but I think also because turnabout is fair play, and they wanted to show Chinese filmgoers that Chinese film had arrived and major stars would now participate in it. We saw this too in Feng Xiaogang's Back to 1942, which came out in 2012, a film set entirely in China, but featuring Tim Robbins from The Shawshank Redemption, who you can see in the upper left-hand corner, and also the Oscar winner Adrian Brody of the pianist, who doesn't even rank a photograph in this poster. But it was, you're seeing in this period a lot of interaction between Hollywood and China, a great deal of enthusiasm, not only for money, but also for creative collaborations. This was also obvious in Rogue One, a Star Wars story, which came out in 2016 and featured Jiang Wen, who you see on the left, and the Hong Kong actor Donnie Yen, who's also in the newest version of Mulan. So a tremendous period of collaboration, but not without controversy. We have, wait, did I get these out of order? Yeah, in the Marvel Doctor Strange film, there's a character called the Ancient One who trains a Marvel superhero. The original Ancient One in the comic books you see on the right was Tibetan, but they whitewashed the character and had Tilda Swinton play the Ancient One and said that she is a Celt, Celts apparently equaling Tibetans in their mystery and their understanding of the dark arts. And this was a direct appeal to Chinese censors. A major Tibetan character probably wouldn't have been allowed to show on screens in China, and so they used a Celtic character instead and wrote the Tibetan out of the film. Another Zhang Yimou film, and I'd say failed collaboration, was The Great Wall in 2016 with Matt Damon and William Dafoe, clearly aiming through co-production with an American film for an international audience, but it was largely seen as a bomb. At the same time, there's another strain in filmmaking, which I think is more positive and really quite successful. We see here 2018's Crazy Rich Asians and 2019's The Farewell by Lulu Wang, which I particularly want to recommend, a really marvelous film. And these are films that harken back in a way to 1993's The Joy Luck Club, which you see on the left, based on the Amy Tan novel, in which you have largely or entirely Asian casts, Asian Americans or Asians from around the world or Asian immigrants telling their own personal stories, aiming for film as film rather than aiming for international box office or global financing, with considerable success, I'd say especially in the case of Crazy Rich Asians and The Farewell. So that brings us to today's topic, Mulan 2020, which I think is trying to work within a number of these traditions that I've just mentioned. Certainly in its visual interest in Chinese exotica and color. It harkens back to Bertolucci's The Last Emperor. In its interest and treatment of the martial arts, we see a lot of elements of Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon. Clearly, as the sequel to the 1998 Mulan film, you see a desire to claim that audience of young Americans and Asians and others around the world who loved the 1998 film. Like Kung Fu Panda, it's going for a truly global appeal. Like The Farewell and Crazy Rich Asians, it has an entirely Chinese cast. And then like other films, including Zhang Yimou's The Hero from 2002, that's a 2002 film, you might see a certain consistent aesthetic between these two. 2020, 2002, you'll see the continuity. Zhang Yimou's Hero, a martial arts film with Jet Li, was big on trying to promote Chinese virtues, defense of the nation, and a certain statist view of Chinese nationalist heroism, which I think Mulan refers to as well. Okay, so with that quick film history lesson, we are very, very glad to have with us today 3 speakers. First, Professor Lan Dong, Professor of English at the University of Illinois Springfield, who is one of the world's leading experts on the Mulan legend through many permutations throughout history, and she's going to spend about 10 minutes to speak about the legend itself so that we can ground this subsequent dialogue in the history of the story. We will then hear from Ray Zhong of the Kissinger Institute at the Wilson Center, who is not only our program associate, but also a blogger on cultural issues as well as technological issues. And she's going to talk about representation issues in the film. What is represented? What's actually on the screen? And what is it trying to say? And then lastly, we're very pleased to have Rebecca Davis, who is the Beijing bureau chief for Variety magazine. She's currently COVID exiled in New York, but she's stationed within China. And she's going to be talking about the reception of the film, both political and aesthetic, how it has been critiqued for its treatment of issues that are sensitive politically, as well as whether it's a good movie or not, and sort of looking at the reviews with us. So we'll have discussion from all 3 of them, and then we would love to hear from you. If you have a question, please send it as an email to china@wilsoncenter.org. That's china@wilsoncenter, one word, .org, and we'll bring you into the conversation. But first, let's turn it over to Professor Lan Dong.
Good morning, everyone. When we talk about Mulan's legend, we have to go back to the earliest written text, a folk ballad called the Ballad of Mulan. The story in the gist in the ballad is about a young woman named Mulan who dresses up as a man and joins the army, taking her father's place. After years of service, she returns home with success, and she changes back to her original clothes and goes out and greet her fellow soldiers, who were, of course, shocked because they had no idea she is actually a young woman. So in a ballpark, that's the story from the ballad. In the long history, the ballad itself comes from the northern dynasties in China. That's roughly between the 4th and 6th century. So in the very long years after that, until this point, we've had a very large number of interpretations, adaptations, and retellings of Mulan's legend, and across different genres, in poetry, in plays, in stories, novels, semi-historical documents, essays, notes, stage performance, and of course, in modern contemporary time, we have film adaptations as well. What sort of coming out of all these adaptations, what we can see is a lot of these adaptations reflect the political and social changes in China. They coming out of sort of the specific context at the time. For example, in a 16th century play, Mulan is portrayed as having bound feet, because women's foot binding was a practice at the time for certain social class in China. And then roughly a century later, we have novels portraying her committing suicide after she returns home, because she received an imperial order for her to come to the palace and become a consort. So she can't exactly defy an imperial order, but at the same time, she wants to protect her purity and chastity, which was very important for women during that social political context. And then later on in the 1930s, Robert mentioned that during Japanese invasion, there were very specific images of the Chinese in American films. During the 1930s, there were stage performances and plays adapting Mulan's story. especially highlighting her nationalism, using her to boost people's spirit in fighting the invasion from Japan. And then, of course, after the establishment of People's Republic of China, Mulan, not very surprisingly, becomes a very highlighted symbol for gender equality when they released a political ideology of women holding up half of the sky, and Mulan, of course, would be at the forefront for that ideology. So you can see sort of the transformation of her story in China has already become entangled with politics over the years. In terms of her adaptations and retellings in English, by the 19th century, we've already seen English translations of the ballad. And then in the early 20th century, there were plays and stage performance sort of adapting her story. Those were not very well known until the 1970s when Maxine Hong Kingston published The Woman Warrior. That's a sort of landmark work, not only in Asian American literature, but in American literature in general. Kingston's Mulan is very different from the ballad. She draws inspiration from the ballad, but also draws other elements from other traditional Chinese stories. For example, the historical poet Cai Yan, and also the nationalist hero Yue Fei. So her story is a combination of different elements. In her description, Mulan experiences a full range of womanhood. She's not only a young woman being chosen, being trained, and having successful military campaign, but she also gets married. Her husband accompanies her during her military career, and she gives birth during her military career and returns home as a daughter-in-law to her in-laws family. So as you can see, her image has changed dramatically at the time. And then besides that, we also have a number of children's picture books adapting Mulan's story. Some of them are in English only, some of them are bilingual in English and Chinese. Some of them stick very close to the ballad. Some of them have more creative liberty in terms of reinventing her story, adding different messages. And then when we move to the 90s, of course, we have Disney's animated film Robert mentioned earlier, the 1998 Mulan, which introduced her name to a global audience. And that movie, Robert also mentioned this, did very well box office wise and also review wise worldwide, except for in mainland China for a variety of reasons. We can talk about that a little bit later. I think that's pretty much what we have until this point. This new live action remake is highly anticipated, entangled in so many political controversy even before its release, and now it's even more. So I'm very eager to hear what Ray and Rebecca have on this new remake.
Thank you very much. Ray.
Okay, so I was asked to talk about how the 2020 Mulan film represents China, represents the character and the definition of femininity. And to start off, I'd really like to really briefly mention the market access issue. In order to produce and or film within China, there were certain parameters that the producers of Mulan 2020 were going to need to fulfill, because pop culture and film products have to sort of move around a lot of government standards, and not even famous directors like Zhang Yimou and actors and actresses can really get around those standards. There is a very specific image of China that Chinese authorities expect to be represented in modern films. So to start off, I think the really prominent issue of representation in the 2020 adaptation of Mulan is the Chinese state. Throughout the course of the 2020 film, the protection of the state is something that is really, really emphasized strongly. So Mulan's motivation within the film is to protect the emperor. And really, really noticeably, when I watched the film last Friday, was her motivation to protect, quote unquote, the Silk Road. So this concept is, I mean, in history, a multinational one. It emphasizes lots of trade routes that stretch throughout Asia. But to center the Silk Road on China is a political choice. And in sort of emphasizing this creative choice within the movie, it sort of subtly enforces the idea of, you know, China's modern idea of the Belt and Road Initiative, which Xi Jinping really, really emphasizes as strategically important economically and politically. Culturally speaking, though, the sort of motivation for this character to protect the emperor and to protect the Silk Road places China's status as a state as a central, calm, civilized society, and one that emphasizes order against the sort of invading horde. In comparing 2020's Mulan to the 1998 film, the way that the Mongolian or Roran enemies are otherized is something that stayed consistent. In the animated cartoon, they were portrayed as gray-skinned, yellow-eyed. They rode horses with demonically red eyes. And so the aesthetics were very coded to be evil and foreign. In the 2020 version, they wore all black and had very heavily defined makeup. They wore clothes that were torn and, you know, kind of foreign looking, whereas the mostly Han Chinese army were wearing like fitted armor and silk. So why does this matter in terms of how the film is made? So the us versus them narrative is not necessarily new, but defending the emperor is sort of elevated to a degree where it really cuts out some of the character motivation of Mulan herself. Her choices, how she develops emotionally, and her values really, really emphasizes the values of patriotism. And so in a film that is being produced for a China of 2020, that creative choice aligns with some of the political developments within China. Xi Jinping's administration has really emphasized the idea of positive energy campaigns. Domestically, this has resulted in children's media and family media really changing to emphasize a very, very specific set of values relating to nationalism, and that the film's narrative really, really makes the defense and security of the nation so important to its main character, I think is a really interesting political coincidence or choice that has really defined the resulting product of the movie. So even before Liu Yifei herself said, you know, I support the Hong Kong police, you may strike at me or hate me, in a post on Weibo, I think the messaging of the film itself sort of enforces nationalism in a bit more subtle way, but nonetheless in a prominent way.
We should note that Liu Yifei is the actress who plays Mulan.
Yes, she is.
The star herself had said this.
Yes, the star herself, who is an American national, but whose career has mostly been concentrated within Chinese cinema. So just to look at the character herself, she also is represented as not necessarily a conventional Chinese heroine, but as a chosen one character who has a special power called Qi in the movie, which is it's named after an energy that is has been used as a theme in Chinese martial arts storytelling, although within the story it's really it's something that she, I think, possesses as a rare magical power, as opposed to the 1998 film, which I watched afterwards to compare since it's a remake, but it really changes her developing problem-solving skills and thinking her way out of problems to becoming the chosen one and really needing to, you know, make the choice to use her magical powers for the sake of nationalism. And I think this is a really, really big representational change that is maybe not necessarily motivated by appealing to the Chinese market, but of retaining a story that is appealing to American audiences as well. So to finish up this discussion of representation, one question that I've seen play out within Asian Americans watching the film is, does a better writer, director, and or other members of the creative team do assigning a more diverse pool of candidates help improve this film? So on technical details, certainly costuming and dialogue can get smoothed over when you have people of that background in the room. In looking over the credits for 1998, the lead character designer of the Mulan animated film was Taiwanese, and they had a, I think, Taiwanese American writer, Rita Xiao, as one of the screenwriters. And so as a result, there are certain technical details that can get improved when you have better representation. However, for Mulan specifically, there are certain political questions of representation that even a diverse crew, I think, would still have to face. Do they push back against Liu Yifei's comments on the Hong Kong police? How do they interact with the Chinese film standards that they still have to pass? How do they communicate with Chinese government entities that are needed to produce and or market in China? And so I think that representation is certainly important, but the concepts that the film still has to navigate, so, you know, how much do we want to center the emperor of China as a character? How do we think about non-Han Chinese as the predominant enemy? I think these are going to be conceptual questions that have a lot of political baggage, no matter who was going to be making this film. So these types of questions, which, you know, are added to Hollywood's notorious problems of exclusion of minorities in storytelling, they don't happen in a vacuum, and oftentimes getting out of them will require a lot of precision. And with that, I would like to hand it off to Rebecca Davis, our next panelist. If you have any questions, please email them to china@wilsoncenter.org. Thanks.
Okay, I'm going to talk very quickly because I think there's just so much to cover here, and I'm so excited we're having this conversation, which brings together a lot of my favorite themes: U.S. China, politics, feminism, cross-cultural representations of that. So I think it would be helpful if we kind of go back and kind of run through the politics and the production in sort of a timeline and talk about the different geopolitical responses that emerged to the film over time. I think everyone knows by now that the big controversy is, in addition to all the other things that came before, that Disney thanks like 8 different government entities in Xinjiang, including the Xinjiang regional, the the highest level propaganda bureau, and the Turpan PSB, the Public Security Bureau. So to sort of ask the question, what could they have known about this? You know, we can't know what their internal discussions were of the fact that they were filming in a region that was, you know, where an ongoing, or, you know, the ongoing worst human rights violations of our generation are occurring. But we can sort of look at the timeline, at least, of when these two things were happening. So the earliest evidence of re-education work happening in Turpan, which is where much of the China stuff for Mulan was shot, starts in about 2013. Mulan was greenlit in 2015. The earliest Western reporting on the camps doesn't really start hitting until around the summer of 2017, however. But in 2017, in September, the director, the New Zealander Nikki Caro, has an Instagram post that shows the beautiful sand dunes and shows that she's in the region of Urumqi, the capital of Xinjiang. Meanwhile, we know that the set designer and the production team spent months in the region around that time preparing, scouting locations. And if you spent any time in Xinjiang as a foreigner, especially, you know that maybe that's a reason to thank the Turpan PSB, because even to spend a day or two there, generally, especially now, you're dogged at every moment by security who follows you and your every move. So they had sort of a special, you know, leniency, I guess, to do that work, clearly. So in 2018, when Mulan is actually filming, Xinjiang is at the height of its Strike Hard campaign, the height of its internment camp internments, and, you know, some of the sites where Mulan is shooting in Turpan and Shanshan County, like the Kumtag Desert. The Kumtag Desert is only like a few kilometers away from a number of different internment camps. That region alone has about, estimates say, about 10 internment camps and 5 prisons, according to what we can sort of assess from satellite images today. So, okay, so we don't know how they're assessing this, if they're aware of it, how could you not be, kind of, but, you know, but what we do know is that, you know, in February, when he was asked about the growing boycotts against the film, Disney Studios chairman Alan Horn did say, if Mulan doesn't work in China, we have a problem. So we know that China is extremely important for this film's bottom line, which is a $2 million budget film. It's the most expensive film ever directed by a woman, which, you know, is cool.
200 million.
200 million, sorry, I don't know 200 million, certainly. So then by last summer, boycotts start brewing in Hong Kong especially. And it's kind of just a Twitter thing, but, you know, there's a huge reaction against the star Liu Yifei's comments in support of the Hong Kong police, and also the other star, Donnie Yen, who is a Hong Konger himself, also coming out in support of the Hong Kong police against protesters. And Liu Yifei writes, "What a shame for Hong Kong," and, you know, clearly aligns herself with the Communist Party line on that particular issue. In the past, both major stars have also come out on the party line on China's controversial 9-dash line in the South China Sea. It's territorial claims to regions that are contested by other Southeast Asian nations. And this makes it a growing Twitter thing among what emerges as this sort of alliance between Southeast Asia, Taiwan, and Hong Kongers who feel at odds with the Chinese superpower. So then we move into Chinese cinema shut because of COVID in January, but Mulan gets postponed not because of the politics or any of that. It's actually getting postponed. Its date is postponed 3 different times because of COVID, actually, and the financial realities of releasing a major blockbuster at a time when no one can go to cinemas. So in March, it still has this like lavish red carpet premiere where Liu Yifei is in this beautiful gown. But that's the same week, actually, that U.S. cinemas actually go dark. And they had the London premiere, and 3 hours later, they're pushing the date back and back. And in the midst of this pushback, so it goes from July to August, and then they say, forget it, we're just going to premiere on our own Disney Plus digital platform, which is a ground-shaking move for the film industry, actually, because that sort of upends the exhibition sector, cinemas, the business of having blockbusters that you can show so that you as the cinema can get a cut and survive so that we have cinemas at all. So this has really shaken up the film industry because people are concerned that if major blockbusters in future go straight to digital, we're not going to have cinemas anymore. And that will change the whole model of how films are financed and loads of things. We can get into that if people want. In the meantime, during this postponement, in June, we have an AP report about, you know, the systemic attempts in Xinjiang to use forced sterilization and different measures of birth control in a systemic way to lower Uyghur birth rates. We have in July, Beijing enacting a controversial security law in Hong Kong. And that same day, this law, which, human rights practitioners around the world have really decried as basically stripping Hong Kong of its former liberties and status as a liberal place of business and free speech. That same day we have the star, Donnie Yen, posting celebration emojis on all of his social media platforms and posting a video of him shaking hands with Xi Jinping and performing for China, the Chinese president. So actually the national security law moment is an interesting one because that's when actually the hashtag boycott Mulan starts to gain traction in Asia. Before it's been kind of a Twitter thing, there's some Westerners kind of involved, but after the national security law comes, it's very interesting to see how different people throughout Asia in their own countries are seeing what's happening in Hong Kong and drawing parallels to what's happening in their country. So you have a rise of support for the boycott in Thailand, where starts with students and becomes a broader movement of citizens going out in rare protests against the monarchy. And they see a parallel between how the monarchy treats them and crushes oppression and the CCP and how that's treating the protests in Hong Kong. Then in the Philippines, you have Duterte in July signing into law a new anti-terrorism act where people can be sent to jail without charges. You have Duterte shutting down ABS-CBN, the largest media entity in the country. So then people in the Philippines are also feeling this solidarity and with what's going on in Hong Kong. And of course, Vietnam and Korea as well, people are sort of siding a bit with the protesters. And so that boycott sort of grew in dimension in Asia. In July, you have the US actually starting to impose sanctions on both Chinese officials affiliated with what's going on in Xinjiang and the Turpan PSB that Disney specifically thanks. So then I guess we'll just speed ahead here to what happened when it actually premiered. So it came out on September 4th, last Friday. And it's hard to tell. So first the question is reception financially. Is it doing well? It's hard to tell because those figures are internal. What we can tell is that over that opening weekend, subscriptions to Disney Plus went up by 68% compared to the week before. That's kind of what we got right now. I think the real sign of whether it's succeeded financially, we'll know better. We can only know based on what Disney says, but we'll know better if, for instance, they decide to release Black Widow through the same method, then we'll know that it was financially reasonable enough for them that they would go ahead and do that with another big title that otherwise would go to cinemas. In terms of the response, some of the most violent responses in the States have come from US politicians, all Republicans, who have been obviously slamming, we've got Wisconsin Congressman Mike Gallagher saying, well, the CCP is committing crimes against humanity in Xinjiang. Disney thanked 4 of the propaganda departments that are lying to the world about these crimes. Hard to deny that, although most of us, I won't, sorry, not to get political. And an interesting response that I found particularly intriguing was lawmakers in Georgia who were upset at Disney's hypocrisy for saying that they would refuse to work in Georgia, where they shot Black Panther and Avengers Endgame, because of their controversial abortion law that bans abortions after 6 weeks into the pregnancy. And Disney at the time said, oh, it's going to be very difficult to do business in Georgia. Many people who work for us will not like that. And, we're very conscious of that, but yet here they are, filming a major blockbuster in Xinjiang. So Georgia, Republicans were sort of crying out that hypocrisy. In terms of the actual artistic reception, so it's very interesting to see in the US that the conversation around Mulan initially, until all the politics has really blown up, has really been one about like representation, the fact that this is one of the first major blockbusters to have an all Asian cast, was celebrated certainly initially. Whereas in China, it's been received as like extremely out of touch. It has epically bad ratings right now on Douban, 4.7 out of 10, which is embarrassing. And what's very interesting is that the things that Disney clearly put in the film to be, that they felt were more original or more authentic to the ballad, those very elements, a lot of them flop in China, where people are like, what? And I can go into that a bit. In general, US reviewers, a lot of them don't mention the political controversy, which is, I think, a debatable choice. I think it's fine, in my opinion, for reviewers to respond purely to, the film as a text, as a work of art. And I know that, so our own reviewer at Variety mentions that this is the most wholehearted embrace of Asian film aesthetics since The Matrix, which, in terms of representation, again, isn't nothing. He calls the style a pastiche of fifth generation cinema and Hong Kong action cinema. He had been having some anime and Bollywood elements. And he says, it's been nearly 2 decades since Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon brought Asian martial arts cinema into the US mainstream. And this is the first time since then that it's driven such a high profile US production. And whereas earlier Mulan also had its like cultural appropriation moments, he says that Caro's version wants to convince us that we're watching the real thing, a film as John Woo or Chen Kai-ge would have made it. And he praises, he thought that the casting of Liu Yifei was a good choice, but that her character was underwritten, clumsy, that the script was bad, and put plot over character. Others have been much harsher, especially reviewers, I think, of Asian descent, of which, of course, a big problem in the industry is, you know, representation and who's the reviewer and who's given that voice to voice their opinion. Another reviewer at The Hollywood Reporter called Mulan's character the void at the center of the storm, saying that especially when you're watching it on a very small screen instead of this giant IMAX vision, you know, there's a lot less to distract you from how anemic the characterizations are, how terrible the storyline is, and how bad the performances are. She called it relatively squeamish, pokily paced movie by committee that has 4 credited screenwriters, a slew of hackneyed Disney tropes, and an enervating lack of emotional resonance. So there's this sense in the US that, you know, it's just, even standing alone isn't a very well executed film. In China, I'll be brief, I know about the timing here, but in China, there's already 17 film or TV versions of Mulan. So this is something that people, there's even one coming out on October 1st, an animated version. So people are familiar with adaptations, and they have deemed this the worst Mulan in history. They say it's worse than The Great Wall. If you've seen Xiao Shidai, Tiny Times, I was very touched by a comment that said, I would rather watch Tiny Times 10 times in a row than watch Mulan again. That's bad. Tiny Times, don't watch it 10 times in a row. It started, I think you can already see that the aesthetic choices were problematic just from the poster and like the font that Disney chose for the graphic design of their China specific posters, which were everyone was just laughing at because it looked so dated and like something you'd see on like in like your xiaoqu in like your compound telling you to take out the garbage or something in the 90s. You know, it wasn't like a very sophisticated font, and that problem reoccurs again even on the sword with the in the film. There's a sword that features prominently with some Chinese characters written on it, and they were like, this is just like the basic Microsoft font that you use, like where's the attention to calligraphy? Does Mulan, you know, what's going on here? But I think some of the major points, very briefly, and then I'll stop. You know, the fact that the concept of qi features prominently in Mulan. She has to learn to control her qi. And you think the people who would understand that best would be the Chinese audience, but the Chinese audience was like totally confused by what qi meant in this context. They're asking, what is the difference between having qi and not qi in this universe? You know, why are there witches? What is, you know, they basically made Mulan into kind of a superhero. And she starts as a superhero and she ends equivalently superhero-ness, and doesn't have that emotional growth because she already starts so strong with her qi. And people are upset because the story is appealing because it's about just an ordinary girl who at the end of the ballad, you know, goes back to her home and puts on her dress again. So I'll stop there.
Well, thank you, Rebecca. Again, for all of our viewers, to ask a question, please send an email to china@wilsoncenter.org. I was very struck, Ray's comments about the representation of the Mongols, who both in the 1998 film and in 2020 are presented as almost subhuman, bestial. The Chinese wear bright colors, they're civilized, they're quiet, they preach virtues, whereas the Mongols are rapacious. They're invaders who seem to have no motivation other than to kill the emperor. And this is something that's actually, you see in other places in China, in Dunhuang, which is the great oasis city out in Gansu, which was on one of the major lines of where the Silk Road entered China. There's a new state-of-the-art 360-degree indoor amphitheater to introduce visitors from all over the world and all over China to the Silk Road. And they do some documentary-style filmmaking of the battles along these oases. And there's a striking scene in that in which the people of the north, the Mongols, proto-Mongols, there were many peoples in the area, are sitting in their oasis, sitting on the ground, eating, big sides of beef, just sort of chewing them up and slobbering them all over themselves, drinking water and letting it dribble all over their faces and all over their clothing. And then they see the Chinese armies coming over the dunes in perfect order, and they panic and they run away. And it looks just like something from Mulan, but it's actually part of the celebration of intercultural exchange in what is now the west of China, in Dunhuang. And there's an additional now critique of Mulan in that within Inner Mongolia in China, people are now being forbidden for the first time to have elementary school students study in the Mongolian language, and they have to study in Mandarin as well. That's yet another growing rap on the film. Why don't we go, Ray, I know we have some questions online. Could you field those for us, please?
Okay. In the view of the speakers, if a different live action film version of Mulan were to be made, what elements should it possess to be quote unquote in China, the US, and internationally? Thanks.
Yeah, that's a good question. How would you fix this? If this version of Mulan was great, if it was the first Star Wars, or if it was the first Indiana Jones and everyone loved it, would all of these political critiques matter as much? And how would you do it better? It's a great question. Maybe we should start, Professor Dong, you know the Mulan legend as well as anybody. What would you like to see in a Mulan film?
That's a great question. Thank you for the audience who asked that. First of all, I haven't seen the film. I know it's shocking to a lot of people. I just had some unexpected events in personal life. I just haven't had a chance. So I can't really talk about the specifics of the live action film. What I can say about what we could do, I think it really depends on the audience, right? Robert and Rebecca and Ray, to a certain degree, all addressed how this film came out the way it is because of the target audience, right? They're trying to woo Chinese market for commercial, cultural, and political reasons, probably. So it really depends on which audience you're trying to capture in order to retell this story. That would shape the story in very different ways. And to very briefly address Robert's question, if this were a great film, would the political controversies we have been seeing would still come up? I personally believe if this were a great film, the political debates and controversies would still surface because they are happening. And because of the timeline Rebecca just provided to us, right? From the time the film was greenlit and then until the time it was released, there was quite some change in terms of the China-US relationship, and there were a lot of political issues going on in China. So I think the quality of the film would not change the political debates we're having right now. It may not have the same, the same debates, but I think we would still be talking about these issues. We would still have to address it in relation to the film.
Rebecca, Ray, any response to this question before we go on to the next one?
Briefly, I think what I would most like to see is a film that stays true to the original ballad in the sense that Mulan wasn't Han, right? She was likely Xianbei, which is an ancestor, like a semi-nomadic group that was the ancestor to the Mongols. And the poem itself has gone through a process of Sinicization over the years that makes people forget that, and she now feels very much like a Han Chinese heroine. But the choice to portray Mulan as defending what very clearly, they don't say directly in the script China, but they do in the subtitles. They say Northwest region, China. So we are situated in the idea of the modern Chinese nation state, which is not something, 中国 as a term didn't even emerge until about the 1900s. So to think about this very ancient time and placing it in a context of ethnic Han nationalism that is a modern phenomenon is it's a very strong choice. And so basically, I think whatever Disney does within that context, it's feeding into the narrative and the idea that that China has been an entity for the past 2,000 years as it stands, as we envision it today, as this Han entity, whereas really in the past 2,000 years, about 1,000 of them China was ruled by non-Han peoples. And so I would like to see a version that goes deeper into the actual historical context of Mulan being a non-Han person, the ballad itself coming from a non-Han language, and then the conflicts between there. I think, yeah, and the more powerful the film is, if the film was a better film, it would just be a better, trumpet for that point of view that, that the Uyghur type, nomadic peoples are backward, and that the imperial state should be obeyed and is good. So in a way, it's fascinating that it's been poorly received, and yeah, I don't think that changes the politics.
Yeah. Just from I think, writing and representational standpoint, Mulan's character arc in the 2020 film, I think, has been the subject of some criticism. And just one sort of aside, her horse in the 1998 film, the horse's name is Khan, which is like it doesn't name it after like emperor or something, but that was, I think, a really interesting note, and her sort of having this really like natural like horsemanship and athleticism. Maybe it's a gesture to certain traditions outside the Han Chinese historical like cultural space. I don't know, but I thought that was interesting. In terms of like writing, her character arc in the movie sort of moves from wanting to like find an identity, but then kind of gets looped into the sort of cause of patriotism and nationalism, and the concept of, putting your family before your own needs. And this shift happens kind of very abruptly. And I think in terms of how it worked in the narrative, it was definitely something that I think could have been handled more organically, and the film sort of paced out a little bit better. For a 2-hour film, they spend a lot of time on, I think, really cinematic looking shots of fighting or of landscapes, and maybe a little less time on their character development. I will move on to the... Oh.
I was going to say, in terms of the cinematography, I was also struck that once Mulan reveals that she's a woman, the film is essentially about her hair. That seems to be the director's and the cinematographer's primary interest. Okay, next question.
Okay. So this is from Ambassador Stapleton Roy, our director emeritus. He asks, could Professor Dong comment on the significance of various surnames associated with Mulan? The main one is Hua, but there have also been others.
That's a great question. I'm glad you asked. There are certainly different surnames attached to her. Most of them are in literary works. I mentioned very briefly earlier, by the 19th century, her records started to pop up in these semi-historical documents. They tend to be a compilation of anecdotes on the local level, major figures, events, and these tend to be tied to another important question, whether or not Mulan is an actual person in history, whether she's a historical figure, right? We couldn't really find specific evidence to say there was this one particular woman who lived during one particular time. But there's no denying there could be people and events that inspired the ballad, because it's started with the oral narrative. They tend to have some origin rooted in real people and real events. And her surnames also had something to do with these semi-historical documents claiming her to a particular place. The ballad itself mentions a few geographical markers like the Yellow River, the Yan Mountain, which helps later people to kind of pinpoint where Mulan was active at the time. And then later on, other people would invent her hometowns based on the documents I've discovered. And there were several places in China claiming to be her hometown. And then in addition to surnames, having the importance of having different surnames puts her into different family lineage, right? If she's a daughter of the Hua family, later documents would invent an entire family lineage for her, from grandparents, great-grandparents, to her parents, and so on, generations. And they would invent her birthdays, burial sites. So yeah, there are a lot of details attached to these different surnames. And Hua itself is a very uncommon surname for Han Chinese, to go back to what Rebecca mentioned, the possible and very likely ethnic identity of Mulan. She is, as far as we know, most likely not Han Chinese based on the ballad. And then later on you have different surnames. For example, Zhu, that would be a much more common Han Chinese surname. So that also gives her sort of different positions in China in terms of ethnicity, in terms of location, and in terms of situating her as a legendary figure or a historical figure.
Thank you. Ray, next question.
Okay. Even if Disney was unaware of Uyghur camps when they started filming, they should have been and did become aware of it later and still made the conscious decision to thank government entities in Xinjiang. What does that say about the priorities of the film and the protection of political and economic interests in the context of U.S. China relations rather than ethical filmmaking?
Rebecca, do you want to take that one on?
Sure. Yeah, it is pretty baffling that after everything, they still put in their special thanks specifically to these Xinjiang government actors. It's baffling. I think if anything, it really perhaps speaks to how out of touch perhaps that, Disney was, that we see with the font choice, that we see with thanking the Turpan PSB, because, actually their CFO, spoke to this yesterday. She was asked about the growing controversy over the Xinjiang stuff, and she said that this has generated some issues for us. Didn't say much more. Didn't say how it would affect, sales or box office. But she did kind of acknowledge that and said that, it was common practice to film in China, you have to have approvals from the authorities. That's very true, and that it's common practice to thank them. So I think it just, I'm sort of speechless on that one as well. Sorry, what was the question again? That
answers it. How could they have been so oblivious to the implications of thanking Xinjiang Public Security Bureau? I think you've answered it.
I mean, they're such a risk-averse company, right? They are extremely risk-averse to the point where they're almost CCP-like in their unwillingness to give interviews or access a lot of the times. But Disney, I think it's really important to remember that Disney has huge financial interests in China because of their two parks, one in Hong Kong and one in Shanghai. Shanghai opened in 2016. And so that means this isn't just about films for them. This is about maintaining a relationship so that they can continue to have that park there, which is a huge, huge cash cow, because that's, beyond just ticket sales for entering the park. That's all sorts of merchandising. There's all sorts of, they have a whole, system of Disney English classrooms throughout the country. They have huge business interests in China that aren't even just box office. And those are probably even greater than what they get from the box office, especially these days as Chinese audiences shift towards preferring, local films like The 800, which just beat Tenet and is likely going to very much beat Mulan there with audiences.
Yes.
In terms of voting with their pocketbook.
I would also add that Disney has likely been watching controversies relating to China, in addition because they own ESPN, which covers a lot of the NBA, which experienced its own sort of, question of Chinese money versus taking a political stand that runs counter to Chinese mainstream thought. I'm talking about Rocket's GM Daryl Morey's tweet on Hong Kong and how it led to the Chinese market reacting adversely to the NBA as a brand. So that if that didn't flag Disney's attention, I would be very, very surprised. All right, one more question. Can any of the panelists discuss more about the reactions, the genuine reactions of Liu Yifei, Donnie Yen, or other Chinese citizens against Hong Kong protesters, given the xenophobic attacks on mainland Chinese citizens in the context of the 2019 Hong Kong protests?
So, I mean, Rebecca, perhaps, I think during the protests, there were a couple of incidents of Hong Kong citizens abusing, in some cases, hitting people who were or were thought to be mainlanders in Hong Kong. And so all of the evidence from mainland China suggests that the Chinese people are broadly supportive of their government's suppression of the demonstrations and even the national security law, because the Hong Kongers were seen as, or portrayed on the mainland as, violent and as anti-mainland Chinese. The question, I guess, is, do you fit Donnie Yen and Liu Yifei's response into that?
Yes, very much so. So, I mean, clearly China has a tight grip on the narrative that's told about outside events internally, right? So there was all the reporting on what happened in Hong Kong has been extremely one-sided. Obviously, the narrative is that the protesters are bad and the police are there to keep order, and there's really broad genuine support for that, even very much among young people as well, who same age group as a lot of the protesters, that they see this as an issue of the Hong Kongers not being properly educated, not recognizing all the benefits that they get economically, especially from being a part of China. Just a real lack of comprehension, like, why would you do this extremely self-destructive thing? Because certainly there's kind of no end game with the protests, right? They are a part of China. They will be assimilated into that system of governance, whether it's now or in 50 years or whatever. Like, given that inevitability, a lot of Chinese people and young people don't, I think, understand why would you be so self-destructive as to go ahead with this. And it's a problem of mentality and education. And clearly, when Donnie Yen and Liu Yifei are speaking out, whatever their personal politics, there's also a component that for their careers to continue in China, which is where they make all their money, they have to, it certainly helps to come out on that way. If they came out the other way, they couldn't work. If they didn't say anything, I don't know, but it certainly helps to come out in favor. And so a lot of their posts on these super political issues have also been just retweets of the People's Daily, the Communist Party mouthpiece. But they kind of have gone a little beyond that as well. So it seems to me like they have an interest in expressing a personal alliance with that. But I did ask Tsai Ma, who plays Mulan's dad, back in like January or something, what he thought about the protests and what he thought about Liu Yifei's politics, and he was like, "Oh, she's so apolitical. Her hand was forced." I don't know, right? So I think what we do know is that there's a financial consequence to saying the opposite, which would be that you're not going to work in China anymore.
Go on, Ray.
Sure. So yeah, I think Leo was circulating a graphic when she supported the Hong Kong police. It wasn't something that she made
a comment though underneath.
Yeah. Oh, really? Okay. Yeah. But I would say that one really interesting thing that happened in response to her and Yen's comments is that Hong Kongers have said that, we don't need you to have a Mulan. And they've used the Mulan nickname to describe Agnes Chow, who is one of the student leaders during the Umbrella Movement and was also active in 2019. And this idea of, the evolving sort of shifting myth of Mulan that Professor Dong has sort of discussed earlier, it's interesting how it can be sort of taken and adapted and molded to various circumstances, even if you know, Mulan, the film, is not something that a lot of Hong Kongers like see themselves in.
I'd like to ask one final question to wrap up, and I guess, Rebecca, it's primarily for you. We began by doing a quick review of the really very rich film history in U.S. China relations, the way that we've looked at, represented, misrepresented each other, the ways that we've worked together, the whole question of co-production. Is that over now? Does the impact of Mulan and the many controversies that it finds itself in the midst of, and its inability to escape the frictions in U.S.-China relations, what does that mean for Hollywood and the Beijing Chinese film industry and the way that they work together? You know, we've got in the pipeline now Marvel's Shang-Chi, The Legend of the Ten Rings, which is a Marvel superhero movie with an all-Chinese cast and a Chinese superhero that seems to be aiming to play in the same field and reap the same advantages that Mulan was aiming for. And of course, Mulan, it looks like, is falling flat on its face. So do you think that this era of co-production and looking at for box office in both countries is over with Mulan?
It's interesting, yeah, with Shang-Chi and with Mulan hitting, I think it seemed like a win-win for studios where you can hit both the US sweet spot, which is like Asian representation, and then you can hit the China market with like, you know, stars that you recognize like Gong Li. I think people are finally realizing it is more complicated than that. Just from a practical point of view, right now, I personally think any major US-China co-production is just on the ice for the near future, purely because it's impossible politically right now in China to hire you know, a prominent American director to feature a US star because of the political, like, basically China is very punishing with its politics in terms of what is allowed to play. And films are a huge investment. It require a lot of risk from companies and financing, and they take a long time. So if you're financing something now, it's not going to come out for another 2-3 years or something. And it's too great of a risk right now politically to prominently use US cast or financing or things like that. Chinese companies have been ordered to keep a really low profile with their co-productions and sort of retrench. And frankly, the Chinese market is big enough and the taste shifting towards local product enough that a lot of companies are reasonably happy to do that. Why take a risk working prominently with a big US company when that could politically blow back and mean even like the day before your film releases, if something happens, it gets pulled, right? Like, why would you take that risk at this moment, in addition to whatever actual directives have come down? And in terms of just people deciding or even envisioning these sorts of projects, I think, you know, these forces of Hollywood working in a particular way with China and creating content to appeal to its censor regime and break through and reach that market has been going on for ages. But, you know, I think we really do see a new attention to this issue kind of since the NBA stuff last year, but, you know, it's really now become part of the public discussion in a way that it wasn't, even though the forces at play were the same for years and years. And so I think that is complicating the question of how you approach that market now, because as the domestic downside also increases, as you get more blowback from US politicians or from US publics about those choices that before they kind of just didn't pay attention to or didn't care, because Americans are really myopic sometimes and very focused on their own things, focused on the abortion law in Georgia and not about the internments of, you know, millions of Muslims in a place far, far away that they can't even pronounce. But as, you know, I think as people become more aware, that will shift the dial on the local risks in the US as well, and therefore, I think, change the landscape.
Yeah, well, thank you. Thanks, Professor Lan Dong, Ray Zhong, Rebecca Davis, and thanks to everybody in the audience for tuning in for this discussion. We hope to see you at the Wilson Center again soon. Have a great weekend.